What is up, guys? Welcome back to another FPL video. And this video we're going to be covering the intermediate tips. So this is going to be for players who are aiming for a top 100k finish. It's not easy to do that, especially during the longer that fantasy football's been going on. It's been harder and harder to finish higher up. So 100k finish is really good, considering that how many players are playing it these days. So yeah, I'm going to just get stuck into this one. I'll start off with, it was going to be 5 tips, and I'm just going to get stuck in and get started with number 5. Okay, so tip 5 for intermediate players would be to identify the value players early on in the season. Now, value players can change quite a lot during the course of the season, but usually they become pretty easy to spot to managers after the first few game weeks. So, for example, in past seasons, there were players in defence like Lundstrom, there were players like Jimenez, who was really cheap, Bamford, Mahrez, Vardy. In past seasons, they became the value players. Now, it was difficult to spot if they were going to continue their form in past seasons, but I guess the earlier you get on those bandwagons, those players, it's actually lower risk in some cases if you're able to kind of justify the pick with a bit of rationale as well. It's lower risk just simply because the longer the season goes on, the more players who are going to own them, and if you don't own them, the harder it is going to be to compete with other players. So the sooner you get on those value picks, and the sooner you identify them, and there's good reasoning behind them, the more leverage it's going to give you in your team. So the main reason for this is because if you can have the value players early on, the amount of points you're getting relative to their price gives you much more flexibility in your team to afford premium players, to play around with the rest of your team much more easily. So if you can get those 4 million defenders or 4.5 million defenders who are gonna be good value, the cheap midfielders who are performing who are going to be good value, the cheap forwards who are going to be playing who are going to be good value, the rest of your team becomes so much more flexible, and you don't have to worry about as many spots and play around with many spots, which means you're less likely to make mistakes. So that's tip 5, is make sure you identify the value players early on in the season and try and get them into your team so long as the pick makes logical sense. Tip 4 is a bit of an unusual one, and it's really a very optional tip. I don't think this is necessary to do for a lot of managers, but it's something that I would like to try out for this season especially. And that tip 4 is to reverse engineer your points tally. So what I mean by that is start off with your aim for your total points for the season at the very beginning of the season. That way you know what target you're aiming for each game week. So if I know that scoring 2,600 points for the entire season, which is very difficult to do, by the way, 2,600 can sometimes mean that you win the whole thing. In order to score 2,600 points for the whole season, I know that firstly that would give me definitely a rank within the top 100k, maybe probably even the top 10k, maybe even top 1k. But I know that I'd have to score roughly 70 points each week for that to happen. So then I can work backwards from there and say, well, what do I have to do to score 70 points each week? And the answer becomes quite clear. It means that you have to kind of break down the amount of points you're going to score in each position. It means that your captain's probably going to have to get at least 20 points. Your defence is going to have to get at least 20 points. Your forwards are going to have to get, maybe defence getting to 20 points is quite unlikely, so your defence is more likely to have to score 10 points maybe, and the other 2 positions, midfielders and forwards, are going to have to score 20 points as well. So that can be quite difficult to do, but at least it gives you a rough idea of what your expectations should be for each game week and from each position. But a more realistic example would be maybe 60 points per week. That would definitely get you in the top 100k. But just having that idea in place and knowing whether you're hitting your target or not can be really useful. It can allow you to really make better decisions because you know week in, week out that if you're not hitting those targets, there's definitely areas you can just start off in, like the simple areas which you can just improve on and at least get that score upwards rather than focusing on getting super high points. For example, if your defence is really underperforming and you know that your defence should be hitting at least 15 points, 10 points per week, you can focus a lot more energy on researching that sort of area and researching the teams who are doing well defensively. It allows you to kind of narrow down and focus on each position and really get into the kind of specifics of stats and players if you know what you're aiming for. So I think that's a really good tip. It is just to kind of like break down each position, know roughly what you're expecting to be scoring from those positions, and yeah, try and focus on it that way. So tip three, it is a bit of an odd tip as well. It's actually to follow your own advice, assuming that your advice makes sense and it's logical, and it can work. Actually, sticking to your advice can be quite difficult at times. And there's a lot of different tips and a lot of different noise in the FPL community, and there's so many temptations, and controlling your emotions when you're playing fantasy football. I've also often compared it to trading in the stock market. You have to be very disciplined and actually stick to your rules, stick to your plan, and because really, if you veer off it, it can end up getting worse if you veer off your plan, and you can just chuck your plan out the window altogether. So if you have a plan at the start of the season, or even just a plan for a few game weeks, try and stick to it. Try not to let your impulses control you in that sense. Just so long as that plan is a good one, and you're confident it works, do your best to stick to it. So my second tip, I think this is a really good tip. I've used this many times in previous seasons, is to identify specific patterns. So this could be something like home and away form. For example, a really good example of this was Burnley. I think it was during the 17-18 or 18-19 season. Their home form was absolutely incredible. Like, they were barely letting any goals, and it really made it easy to rotate keepers, to know when to play the defenders. It made for such good and easy rotation predictions. But for example, their away form was terrible. But what that meant is that I could target teams who were playing them at home, or playing where Burnley was away. I could target the team that they were playing against them, and I knew to avoid Burnley players and to put my Burnley players on the bench when they were away from home. So home and away is a really good example of spotting a pattern. If a specific team doesn't really have a home and away pattern, or they don't really have any tendency to play better on one, then just kind of ignore that team a little bit for that specific pattern. Try and find another pattern which that team follows. For example, it could be set pieces. Maybe that team is really vulnerable to set pieces, and they're playing a team who's really good at scoring set pieces. You have to kind of spot those patterns early on, because that's going to help you make not just better player predictions, but better match predictions as well. And that's a tip I'll get into my advanced tips, but being able to understand the strengths and weaknesses of a team, and the patterns that are involved in that is really, really useful for fantasy football. So yeah, that's a really good tip, is to spot patterns of teams, things like home and away form, things like set pieces, things like even, you can get even more specific than that, like where do they attack more, on the left or right wing. I mean, there is data and stats on that on a website like, for example, Who Scored, that shows stats on which wing where they get most of their play from. But yeah, spotting patterns and noticing little things like that can really make a difference. So my number one tip for intermediates, and this is kind of elaborated a little bit more in the advanced tips, but my number one tip for the intermediates is to just try and understand how each team plays, what style of football they play, because as we'll see in the advanced tips, I'll give this one advance for the advanced tips, which is to try and predict the match outcomes before you pick your players. And one of the best ways to predict match outcomes is to understand how each team plays, and how their style pairs up against the team they're playing. It's a bit like in boxing. There's a saying which says that styles make fights. It's very similar in football. Styles of football make the game. If you've got a counter-attacking style football versus a park the bus style football, there's probably not going to be that many goals. But if you've got possession-based, on the front foot, very high energy versus counter-attacking, there's probably going to be a lot of goals. So it's a really interesting area of the game to try and understand. It's how you think each team sets up. If you've got a team that parks the bus, you may avoid their attacking players but focus on their defensive players. Or if you know a team that's going to park the bus and they do it very well, you're not going to captain a player against that team. This has worked many times. For teams who are considered the lower league teams, not as good, but when they come up against a top 6 team, they may park the bus and it still be a really low scoring game, but loads of people will captain against them. It's because they didn't predict how that team was going to play. They didn't predict that well, actually, they're going to park the bus, so they're not going to get many chances, this team. So understanding styles of play and how they match up against each other, in my opinion, is a really important part of the game. For example, looking at the first game week, I would say that styles of play which will make for an interesting game would be Chelsea versus Crystal Palace. I think that Chelsea are great on the counter attack, but they're also really good in possession and pressing. But Crystal Palace are introducing a whole new style of play, which is going to be more attacking, more aggressive. So I think that's going to be a really entertaining game to watch. Again, Norwich versus Liverpool, I think it's going to be a very open-ended game. I think Norwich play high, pressing, attacking football, and so do Liverpool, so I think it's going to be end-to-end. But then, for example, let's have a look. For example, Man United versus Leeds. Man United tend to play much more counter-attacking football. Leeds tend to play much more high-energy, high-pressing, attacking football. So that could go either way. Now, I would say be cautious on the very start of the season, because sometimes managers do tend to switch things up, but you can kind of figure that out by looking at it, how they're playing in pre-season, because they may not necessarily play the same style of football as last season. For example, Man United may no longer play counter-attacking football as much this season. They may start to play more possession-based football, or more direct attacking style football rather than counter-attacking. So keep an eye out for that at the start of the season. But that's a really important tip for intermediates, is figure out how each team plays, and that will help you make better match predictions, which in turn will help you make better play predictions. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. I hope it was useful. You found it useful. If you did, make sure to stay tuned for future videos, especially my advanced tips videos. That's going to be an interesting one, because the advanced tips is going to be for top 10k players, although I've never made it in the top 10k, so it's actually more advanced tips for me, and making sure that I follow these as well, because it actually goes off one of the tips I just said in this video, which is that you can create good advanced tips and have good logic and good strategy, but if you don't follow through the strategy, you're not gonna go far and get in that top 10k. So this is going to be a really good video. The advanced tips is going to be a really good video for myself as well. So I hope everyone's looking forward to that, and stay tuned for that.